Hello and welcome to this poetry comparison webinar. It's about power and conflict poetry, and there are three key learning aims. The first one is to understand the poem, the Emigrée. The second one is to understand the poem Poppies. And finally, we're looking at comparing the poems for a specific assignment. Now, this assignment is compare the presentation of loss in the Emigrée and Poppies. The idea behind this is that by the end, you'll be able to write this assignment very confidently and secure a grade 5. Now, let's get straight into this and look at the poem Emigrée by Carol Rumans. There was once a country. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which I am told comes to the mildest city. The worse news I receive it cannot break my original view, the bright, filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes, glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. I have no passport. There's no way back at all, but my city comes to me on its own white plane. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So you can see from the title, well, you may not be able to know that the title Emigrate actually means immigrant. So it's all about someone leaving their homeland and coming to a new land. It's about immigration and the change and the loss of your homeland and the loss of a mother tongue and a loss of an original culture. Now, it starts off with there was once a country. It sounds like a fairy tale, and that's a really important idea. So although she's lost her identity in terms of being from that country, although she's lost her homeland, she's lost that culture, she hasn't lost the memories. She hasn't lost that feeling and that connectedness that she has because she knew it as a child, and that childlike innocence, that perception of it being beautiful and glowing and pure and special and untouchable and untaintable remains with her even as an adult. There was once a country, so you've got that fairy tale idea. That's something that's almost imagined because it's in a distant past that's hard to remember, but it doesn't dull and it doesn't fade in her memory. I left it as a child, but the memory of it is sunlight clear. So you can see in that second line, that idea of sunlight, which is repeated again and again, that epiphora, or the very last line of the last word of each final line is repeated again and again, is a really important idea. The memories are full of light. Despite the harsh reality of being a difficult place, and she had to run away and probably take refuge, become a refugee in another country, still the idea and the memories are full of light. They're sunlight clear. So you can see that she left in November and it was a mild time, but there was bad news breaking. So it was obviously a difficult time, and it says that there was war in that stanza. There were tyrants, which means she fled, worried for her own safety and her family's safety, but she still has the impression of sunlight. So despite the reality of the fact that she had to leave her city, her homeland, when there was war and when there was tyranny, that means people who don't respect humans and they want people to obey in a brutal and cruel and vicious way, despite that, she still remembers it as a beautiful place. Stanza 2 intensifies this idea of beauty when she talks about the white streets and the graceful slopes. She also talks about having coloured molecules of grammar on the tip of her tongue and spilling out from her. However, she's like a hollow doll. So that says that sense of loss, this inside her, the satisfaction and the desire will never be filled. It's hollow, so it's kind of insatiable. It can't be filled because she's lost something. And yet, despite the frontiers and the tanks and all of that violent and oppressive military imagery, it tastes. So even her tongue, the language that she's able to learn, or she's been able to retain as a child, tastes of sunlight. There's something exciting and beautiful and pure about it. Now here we can see the shift into a new country. I have no passport to go back. So she's here, even though she's an immigrant, her identity, her nationality, her culture is here. But she's branded as dark. She's encircled, and there's this idea that she's threatened. Death is muttered to her. There's an idea that because she's an immigrant, people see her as inferior, and there is a genuine threat to her safety in her new home. And yet she protects. The city hides behind me. She protects the idea of her own culture. She protects the idea of her homeland, that beautiful, precious, innocent idea. And the sun, the shadow, evidence of sunlight, that means it's beautifully lit. And despite the fact that she has a shadow, she's seen as dark. There are people who accuse her of being absent and they encircle her. There's a sense of threat. She's full of light. So there's that positivity mixed with the threat in that final line. So that's that first poem. Let's look at Poppies. This is Poppies by Jane Weir. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, the poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned on your lapel crimpled petals, a spasm of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias, binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like its treasure chest. A split second, and you were gone. You were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went to your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and there it is, and it is where it's led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks and darts and pleats, and hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of a hill, I traced the inscriptions of the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. A dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. Now, this poem is about a female character who's not involved in war herself, but it's through being a mother, her son is going off to war. Now, it's very implicit, that means it's hidden, but he dies, and it's about the pain and the suffering and the loss and bereavement that a mother feels because of war, due to conflict, because she's had to say goodbye to her son that she has seen, and she's brought him up, and she has to lose him physically and emotionally. So it says at the beginning, 3 days before Armistice Sunday. So Armistice Sunday is the 11th of the 11th, or the Sunday's closest to the 11th of 11th, where there's that 2-minute silence, and many, many churches across the country recognize that as well. And so it starts off with this idea of remembrance. And you remember things that you've lost, you remember things that are no more. And it also talks about poppies being placed on individual war graves. So we begin with this idea of loss through death, that the war graves of individuals are recognized. And this is a very personal kind of narrative from a mother's perspective. So it's again about individuals who have to suffer loss through war. Now she talks about pinning the poppy on his lapel, and the crimpled petals show that kind of disruption, spasm, and disruption, and the blockade are all foreshadowing his leaving, going to war, but ultimately his death. The spasm of red paper in particular makes us think of pain and suffering and distress in death. Now the second stanza It's very much about domestic imagery and this kind of maternal connection that's being lost with her mother. She talks about the sellotape on the hand, the cat hairs. She wants to play Eskimos and rub his nose. She wants to ruffle his hair, and she resists all of it because he's a big boy. He's grown, he's in his army uniform, he's just about to leave, and she has to resist the impulse, she says, of really going back to that very infantile behavior. She can't infantilize him. She can't pretend he's a child because he's a grown man. He's made his decision. He's off to war. However, you can see that there is that tenderness between them because she wants to do those things that they used to do, rub noses, and she is trying to kind of take the cat hairs off. So that kind of role as a mother of making her son look even more presentable. Then we have here this enjambed stanza. So stanza 2 runs into stanza 3. She talks about her words flat rolled, turned to felt, slowly melting. So you can see that the stanza 2 and stanza 2 shows this shift. It's a shift, it's a loss. She's losing him because in stanza 3, she opens the door, throwing it open, and he leaves her in a split second. It's that short. And she says he's intoxicated. It's that desire for freedom that young people have. There's no way that she can cocoon him from the world. And as he leaves, she has some very symbolic actions. She goes to his bedroom and releases a songbird from its cage. Again, that may well be this idea as a parent, letting go of your child because he's made his own way in the world, he's made his own decisions. Again, however, it could be about her loss, his death. Songbirds and birds and from their cage could be this idea of him ascending upwards and his body and soul being separated. He's being departed physically, and it could signify his death. She also, in this stanza, talks about the single dove that's leading her. She's skirting the graveyard. Now, the churchyard, I should say, is a place where we think about the dead, where people are actually often buried or their ashes have been scattered. So this is very much signifying the loss of her son through death in war. You can see how unprotected she is because she has no scarf, no gloves to protect her. And again, this is about exposing her vulnerability because of her loss. The final stanza will really explain the impact, and it talks about how the dove is having this ornamental stitch. It's as if her world is falling apart, and the dove, the symbol of peace, having peace and reconciling herself with the situation, she's able to piece back all the aspects of her life that are falling apart, and she's able to remember him as a child with a playground voice. Now let's look at the 2 poems. Attaining the top marks are all about trying to think about the assessment objectives. So AO1, 2, 3, and 4, you're being assessed in this poem if you're following the AQA criteria. So AO1 is about looking at deeper meanings, so really thinking about hidden ideas behind. AO2 is using subject terminology and being able to say metaphor or caesura or enjambment. AO3 is really making links between the poems and thinking about the context, and AO4 is you writing well. And so how do you get the top grades? How do you get the highest marks? To get to level 6, you need to be convincing. That means you have to have a really sharp ideas. You need to be critical. So don't just give your own opinions. Think about what the writer is doing, the writer's purpose. You need to explore, to consider this could mean, or this could also mean this. So when you see poetry, you smile, talk about the structure and meaning, talk about the imagery and language, talk about the effect and the context, and you can use the hanger method where you talk about both poems first of all, and then you talk about one and then the other. So both poems have a very dynamic and important start. So in Emigrée, it starts off with a fairy tale opening, and the caesura, however, shows us the uncomfortable reality. And with Poppies, we have this bleak opening that's foreshadowing her grief. As it develops, both poems show this kind of emptiness. We have this idea of the hollow doll, even though she's filled with the grammar that spills out. It's hollow. It's that sense that she's left behind her heart, or it's been taken away from her somehow with her immigration. And then as she releases the songbird from its cage, you can see the loneliness and pain that she's able to let go. Both poems also end in some aspect of despair, but it's mixed with a sense of possible hope. We have the idea that they mutter death. It's emphasizing the despair that moving to a new country, and yet her shadow is evidence of sunlight. The last word is sunlight. There's a sense of hope that despite all the trauma and the loss, she's able still to have those powerful, positive memories of her homeland. In Poppies, we end in that desperation. She's trying to recapture the playground voice, and yet we could see it positively, because it's powerfully reminding herself of the connection and the love that they had when her son was a boy. We also have the fact that both of them have a sense of a loss of identity. In Emigrée, she's being surrounded by these racist comments and prejudice. They accuse me of being dark, and they see her as ignorant. And so there's that loss of kind of her true identity. But in Poppies, you perhaps have this loss of innocence and childishness, because you have him taking risks, looking for the treasure chest as pirates did, intoxicated. So there's that risk-taking of youth, and perhaps he didn't really understand the reality of war, and the dreams surpassed and superseded them. Both of these use very pertinent imagery. In Emigrée, it's the light imagery. The sunlight is the epiphora or epiphora at the end of each stanza. And we have this sense that, despite the loss of the homeland, the mother tongue, identity, it's an unbreakable bond, and the memories cannot be lost. The sewing imagery in Poppies is very pertinent, and the tucks and the pleats and the dives and the stitches that's looked at in stanza 3 and 4 is about her pulling herself together after the grief and bereavement of losing her son. And then we have powerful figurative language in both of them. In Emigrée, you have personification, when you've got the fact that the city comes to her and she combs its hair and she loves its shining eyes. She almost personifies it, perhaps as a doll, as a dog, as a child. There's that sense of connection that, again, as I've said, that cannot be lost. And you've got this metaphor of the sellotape bandaged around her hand. So stanzas 1 and 2 really foreshadowing stanzas 3 and 4, the pain of separation and the pain of those memories as she tries to take the cat hairs off with sellotape. But the word bandage is really showing that trauma and suffering that the mother is experiencing even before he leaves. And then finally, we can see that both of them have been written to in first person, to really empathize and to really have compassion for a sense of loss. Obviously, this is a loss of dignity because of war. Her home has been taken away from her because of the dictators, and it was no longer safe for her and her family. And yet she doesn't lose that powerful connection. She doesn't lose that sense of pride. And you can see here that this again is the speaker stealing the softening of my face. The writer seems to want us to understand that even those who are not directly involved in war, like the immigrant speaker in Emigrée, suffer greatly. And the poet really considers the great personal loss of individuals who grieve for war victims, how she's been stripped of that connection with her son, how she's been kind of robbed of that history and that intimacy with her son, and all she has really are the memories of his childhood and the connection that they had when he was little. So if you are feeling confident after this webinar, I hope that you will have a go at writing this assignment. Compare the presentation of loss in Emigrée, and I hope that you will think about how both of these look at loss, and you include quotations, and you'll comment on the use of language and structural features like engagement and caesura. You would hopefully comment about the use of imagery and the use of metaphor and personification. You'll explain what the use of this is and how they are similar and different. Thank you so much for joining me in this webinar. I hope you feel confident that you can achieve the grades that you need for this assignment for the presentation of loss in Emigrée and Poppies, and join me next time.